Abram, even though he's listed in the book of Hebrews as being in the hall of faith, he didn't always have great faith. And as I said before, it's more of a story of growing faith. So when we're introduced to him at the beginning, we know that God has spoken to him, and that's a big deal because Abram was not from a religious family. Abram lived in an area that was pagan. They had many gods, and they prayed to idols made of stone and wood. And so when Jehovah God speaks to him, this is something new and different. And yet we know that when God speaks to Abram, it does make an impact. Even though a lot of times it's presented that Abram heard from God, go to this place that I will tell you, and he picks up his family and goes. As we read in Genesis chapter 12, that's not really how it happened. But at the very least, Abram told his dad that God has spoken to me and said that we need to go to some place, but he hasn't told me where to go yet. And his father, being an idol worshiper, probably said, well, if a God wants us to do something, then we better do it. And so his father picks up the family and takes off. And they travel up the Euphrates River, about 577 miles, and they settle in a place called Haran. Well, they weren't supposed to settle yet. This was a command that God had given that was kind of open-ended. It was a test of faith. God does not give us a playbook. God will give us an instruction that is just as much as we need to know at that time. And he wants us to step out in faith with that instruction that he's given, even when we don't know why or what's next. He really wants to just see if we will trust him. And so that's what happened. But it wasn't until Abram's father died that now Abram is in charge. And he picks up the family and he continues on looking for the place that God will show him. The problem at this point, though, is that he didn't completely follow the instructions. The original instructions were just him and Sarah. Well, his whole clan went with him at the beginning. Now that his father's died, he's still traveling with the clan. And he still has his nephew, Lot, with him. So again, he's kind of obeying, but not completely obeying. So he's still traveling with an entire entourage. So we're going to pick up in the children's story today with more of a focus on his nephew, Lot. So when Abram traveled to the land of Canaan, he took everything he owned. Abram was very rich. He had lots of tents, lots of silver, lots of gold, and herds of animals. Abram's nephew traveled along with Abram, and his name was Lot. And guess what? He had lots and lots of animals. Between Abram's sheep and Lot's sheep, there was hardly enough grass and water to go around. Before too long, Abram and Lot realized that there just wasn't enough for everyone to stay in the same place. Abram was older, and he had the right to choose first, but he didn't want to argue over land. Abram allowed Lot to choose where he wanted to keep his sheep. Lot chose the beautiful valley with the city to the east, while Abram ended up with the rugged hills and not much water. So it was decided that Abram would stay in Canaan, while Lot would move near the city of Sodom. Lot chose to live in the rich, fertile plains near Sodom, where the men were very wicked. Do you think Lot made a good choice? No. Before too long, a war broke out between the kings that lived near Lot. Lot and his family were taken prisoner, and all of their possessions were stolen. Abram heard the horrible news. Even though he now lived far away, he was still Lot's uncle. He had to help. He organized his servants and he set out to rescue Lot and his family. With God's help, Abram rescued his nephew, Lot's family, and recovered their possessions. So that's the children's story. And they missed a whole lot in the children's story. So of course, like we do, we're going to go back and fill in the gaps. Okay. How many of y'all heard this story before? Okay, just a few of y'all. So usually this is something that gets skipped over though. You know, we'll talk about Abram setting out on the travels, and then we'll talk about Lot's trouble with Sodom and Gomorrah. But there is stuff in between that we need to talk about, because again, it has to do with the consequences of decisions that we make. So we've already talked about some of those consequences. What was the consequence of Sarah thinking that God needed help in making a child? She had Ishmael. That was an unplanned child. And because of that, Ishmael became the father of what nations? The Arab nations. And then when Isaac came along, Isaac is the father of the Jewish nations. And because of the strife that Isaac's mother, Sarah, and Ishmael's mother, Hagar, had, that set up a battle between the Arabs and the Israelites that continue through today.
That's why they say the just will live by faith. Shouldn't believe what God says instead of helping God.
God doesn't need any help. And we think God needs help all the time. Oh, all right, so yeah, I'm going to help you do this. And that's not what he wants us to do. Okay? A lot of times God just wants us to shut up and listen. And then after we hear the plan, execute the plan the way that he wants us to. Then last time we talked about when Abram and Sarah were in Egypt. Abram thought that he had a better plan than God. And so he told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. What was the consequences of that? He was in trouble. Yeah, so the Israelite God, Jehovah, put a curse on Pharaoh and his family in order to keep Sarah pure. But what that did is that set up a hatred in the Egyptians for Jehovah God. And that hatred continued through the time that Moses came along. Why wasn't Pharaoh going to yield to the God of the Israelites? Because according to their history, the God of the Israelites only brings curses. And that's what continued through all of those plagues that we know about in Moses's time. So our actions have consequences that last a lot longer than just us and the decision that we might make. Okay, so let's fill in the gap here. So this account was taken from Genesis chapter 13 and 14. So that's where we're going to be hanging out today. So you get the gist of the story from the children's story, but there's a whole lot of meat that's missing in this story. So we got to go to scripture to fill in the blanks. So Abram was going back to where God said he would give land to his people. Okay, that's a point that I need to bring up again. So if you remember, as they were traveling from the north, from Haran, where Abram's father took them, they were heading south. He still had the whole entourage. And as they were traveling through Canaan, God did speak to Abram and said, this is the land that I'm going to give your descendants. But he didn't tell him to stop. because it's, again, Abram's not completely following God's instructions. That's how they found themselves in Egypt with more trouble. Okay. But he now left Egypt and he's going back north to the area that God said, this is where I'm going to give land to your descendants. Okay. So the second thing is that Abram was very rich. Why?
God bless them.
How did God bless him? Where'd they just come from?
The Pharaoh.
Yeah, so if you remember, Abram did lie to Pharaoh and said, Sarah's my sister. Pharaoh wanted to take Sarah as his wife, and so he paid a bride price to Abram. It was a dowry, yeah. And that dowry was jewels and gold and silver and flocks and servants. So now Abram has taken all of this stuff with him, and he didn't steal it. Pharaoh told him, just take it and go. It's kind of the same thing that Pharaoh told Moses. Yeah. Take all this stuff and just go, get out of here. So I guess the Egyptians just have and that's how God provided for him. Absolutely. So it sounds kind of crooked, maybe Moses should have gave that back. It's kind of like you break up with your fiance, you better give that ring back. It's uncool, but sometimes you just leave it be. It's better to just cut ties, let it go.
I'm pretty sure that Pharaoh wasn't a good person anyway.
He was actually. The Pharaoh that was dealing with Abram was just following the custom of the day. He could have stolen Sarah. He could have. That was his right as king. But instead, he went to Abram as the nearest kinsman, and he tried to negotiate a fair price, which was the custom of the day. Pharaoh followed all of the rules of society at that point. He did good according to society, but God still plagued him because the bigger picture was God's people. God's people was this line that was going to come from Abraham and Sarah. He had to keep Sarah pure, and he had to keep Sarah in Abraham's company.
But also, too, there were no righteous people in Egypt.
No. Okay. Now remember, this is only about 400 years after the flood. Okay. Weren't very many people around, but they still were familiar with this God that destroyed the entire earth and saved a few. Okay. So we're only maybe like 4 to 8 generations after the flood. A lot can happen just in one generation. If you don't teach your children the ways of God, the very next generation is godless. Okay. So they know of Jehovah God, but they've also got their other gods. Yes. Ham, Shem, and Japheth is Noah's sons. And that's why I have that timeline still up there on the wall so that you can kind of see what's going on. They have the first-hand accounts. Absolutely. Yep. All right. Next is that we hear that the land couldn't support 2 men's flocks and herds. That struck me as surprising, because if this is only like 400 years after the flood, there shouldn't be too many people around, right? What did I tell you the estimate was? Maybe 1 million people at the most, given how soon they can start bearing children and how long they can stay in childbearing years. Maybe 1 million at the most. The problem is that they didn't disperse. They didn't spread out. They were still very clannish. They were still hanging out together. And so there were already people here that hadn't spread out. And now we've got Abram and Lot's flocks that are so big that the land where they were just couldn't support that many. Okay. This is the land that we're told is flowing with milk and honey. It should be able to support 2 people's flocks. Well, the problem is it's not just 2 people. You have a question? Okay.
Someone's not supposed to be there.
So, and that's the other thing. So, and then in verse 7, we see this weird thing. It just kind of like in parentheses, it says, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living there. That's kind of weird, but that's a note to us that this is not an unpopulated place. Even though they're traveling through the wilderness, the only reason it's called wilderness is because it's not the city. It's urban. I mean, it's rural, not urban. Okay. So they are in a place where there's already a lot of people. And the reason there's a lot of people is because there's fresh water. People hang out by the fresh water. So there's already clans of nomads that are here. These are the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And so now we've got Abram's people and Lot's people, and they're all competing for the same grass and the same water. That's why the land couldn't support them. Okay. All right. Now we need to kind of read between the lines here a little bit. There's another reason why it tells us that the Canaanites and the Perizzites were here. It says that disputes broke out between Abram's and Lot's herdsmen. So what's the problem when a family group who's supposed to be getting along is now squabbling and there's potential enemies nearby? If you're infighting, you're so occupied with each other, you're not paying attention to your enemies, and they can take advantage of that situation. Y'all know how it is. If you show weakness, the enemy's going to attack. And that's the problem that Abram sees. And Abram says, we shouldn't be fighting anyway, but we really shouldn't be fighting in this land surrounded by all of these people that already don't like us. That's what's going on. So in verse 8 and 9 in the story, that's where Abram gives Lot the first choice. Okay, we need to go ahead and separate, but Lot, you can pick where you want to go. Now it's Abram's right as the eldest to make the first choice. But instead, he does something sacrificial and he lets Lot make the first choice. Now, Lot would have been okay with Abram because that's how it's done. The old guy gets to make the first choice and I get what's left. That's just how it is. So I'm okay with that. But now Abram tells Lot he can make the decision. Why did Lot choose where he went? All right, so that's the first thing that we see, is that Lot is going to choose to go to the east. And because that is the Jordan River Valley, all the fresh waters there, all the green grasses there, there's plenty of lush areas for his flocks and his crops, or flocks and herds to flourish. So he picks that fertile area. So that's the easy answer. Okay, there is a much deeper, bigger answer here. Where did God want Abraham? In Canaan, which is to the west. So why did Lot choose to go east? Yeah, it was more fertile there, but really it was because the Holy Spirit came on him and moved him that way, because God wanted Abram in Canaan, which is to the west. God is going to get his way, one way or another.
That was my question, was how come this nice plush land for Lot was available and this rugged terrain, desert stuff was given to the blessed man? It was part of God's plan to say, you go near the green pastures. Abram back to where he needs to be.
Absolutely. So, and that brings up another question. Why doesn't God want his people to always have it easy.
Because then they think they can rely on themselves. They don't need God.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And boy, if I get guilty of something, I got this. I don't, if I need you, I'll call on you. And he'll let you hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then he goes, I was wrong. I thought I could do this, but he'll pull you back up.
When you get knocked down, you look up.
Absolutely. So God wants us to be always dependent on him. And it's not because he's wanting to, keep us under his thumb. He's always looking for an opportunity to bless us. If we're already blessed by ourselves, it's like, well, guess they don't need me, so I'll just stand back and watch. And just like Gary says, usually when we start doing that is when we start making the stupid decisions and we get ourselves in trouble. And when we're in trouble, that's when we say, oh yeah, God, sorry, I've been ignoring you for a while, but I kind of need you. And then God will say, okay, thank you for looking back to me. Here we go. And pick up right where you left him. Did you catch what I said there? He picks up where you left him. Okay.
Difficulty and challenge are faced. And that's what we forget.
Faith is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, but there's also a neat foreshadowing that Moses put in here when he wrote this down. Okay. Now remember, Moses is writing these first 5 books, and he's writing them after the events occurred. So as Moses is writing this, he's like, yeah, I know the troubles that happened with Sodom and Gomorrah later. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this in here also. He says about Sodom that in this area down in the valley by the Jordan River, that they constantly sinned against the Lord. That word constantly is important in there. It's not like, well, they're living their lives and everything is cool, and every once in a while they sin. No, this is an area of constant rebellion against God's ways. Okay, these are people who are known by their rebellion against God's
They
ways.
have no morals, they have no ethics.
Yeah, we're talking not immoral, they are amoral. They are without morals whatsoever. No concept of right or wrong. It's just do whatever feels good. That's how these people were living. And so Moses writes this down in there and says they constantly sin against the Lord. So he's setting up the next story. What's the next story? Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, in here, my version, it's in parentheses, but it says this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. So he's setting it up, setting up the story. Good storyteller. All right. So God tells Abram his promise again. This is the 3rd time now that Abram needs to be reminded. So if you remember, the first time that we saw this was in chapter 12, verse 1. It says, now the Lord had told Abram for him and Sarah to go to this place that he would show him. So that means sometime before chapter 12, verse 1, God had already told him. And then in 12:1, he tells him again. And now here we are in 13, verse 14, and he's telling him again, go to this place that I'm going to tell you, and I am going to make you a family that goes on and on and on. Okay, that's the promise. So God then tells Abraham, or Abram at this point still, now that you're here in Canaan, I want you to go walk the length and the breadth of the land, because this is the land that I'm giving you and your descendants forever. Okay, I thought this was kind of interesting because when when we get like a piece of property that we're going to buy today, one of the requirements by the Texas Real Estate Commission is that that piece of property get surveyed, right? And that survey sets out the corners and the edges of that property, sets out the boundaries, okay? So it gives a good description of where that property is. But this is way before that. So when God is telling Abram to go walk the length and the breadth of the land, it's kind of like an explorer. When an explorer goes into uncharted territory, what they do is they start walking around and they start measuring things and they start drawing out, where are the rivers? Where's the valleys? Where's the mountains? Where are the creeks? Where's the grass? Where's, the places that things don't grow? And they make a map of the exploration. And so that's what God is telling Abram to do. Go capture the lay of the land. I want you to see exactly what it is that I'm giving you. So this would be like what Lewis and Clark did. They were explorers, right? They were exploring America before America was mapped. And as they were going, they had to chart everything that they saw. I love maps. Always have loved maps. I saw a map yesterday of one of the early Greeks, and I can't remember which one it was, but he was drawing a map of the known world. Well, at the very center of that map was Greece. Well, it makes sense. He was a Greek. And any exploring that he did would be from there. And he would go up this way as far as he could go. And so he drew that out. And he'd go this way as far as he could go, and that way as far as he could go. And so he ends up with this map that is round, but it's flat. The idea of the flat earth came from the early map making, because people were traveling from a center point and just walking along the surface of the earth as far as they could. And then as they were able to get in ships, they were able to sail further, but all that did was expand the edge of the flat earth. It wasn't until somebody traveled west and ended up to a point on the east that they realized, this isn't flat. It's a sphere. And so I just thought that's kind of neat how God told Abram, go and survey the land by walking the length and the breadth of it. Length, breadth. So width. Okay. Then it turns the page into chapter 14. And it gets us into a story called the Battle of the Nine Kings. How many of y'all are J.R.R. Tolkien fans? Lord of the Rings?
Yeah.
All right. So in The Hobbit, at the end of The Hobbit, there was a chapter that's called the Battle of the Five Armies. And the way that it was put on the movie, it was epic. We're talking millions of soldiers from this army and millions of soldiers from this army, and they're all meeting on this battleground in order to battle. And then one of the armies was the Eagles, and they came in and fought that battle too. And that's not what we're talking about here. Remember, this is only about 400 years after the flood, where everybody got wiped out except for one family. So now when we're talking about kings, we're really just talking about tribal leaders. Okay, they were kings of their tribe. So it may be 1,000 people, but not many more than that. But it's still an important story anyway. So Genesis 14 verses 1 through 12 tells about a battle of 4 kings in the area. These were the bigger cities, fighting with 5 rebel kings. Those were the smaller cities. During the process, the victors were sweeping up stragglers and picking up the spoils of war. And poor Lot and his family got swept up in the process. all of their workers, their flocks, their herds, and their possessions was all taken. So this introduces a new chapter in Abram's life. And so I talk about General Abram. Okay. One of Lot's men escaped when they were being captured. And he runs over to the area where Abram had settled and tells Abram everything that happened. So it tells us here that Abram mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Does this mean that Abram has 318 children? Grandchildren? No, at this point, he still has none.
Just like the slaves and the workers.
Exactly. So we talked about this before. If any of his workers, servants, or slaves have any children, then they belong to Abram as well. Okay, so that's who he's talking about. But now think about this. Out of all of those children that are born, are all of them going to be trained to fight? No. But 318 of them were trained to fight. So how many do you think he had?
Yeah, I bet he brought some of those guys from Egypt.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was because remember, that was part of the dowry. Part of the gift was servants and slaves. So he's got thousands of people now that are moving along with him. Okay, so he's got a pretty big tribe at his disposal. 318 trained men are now going to be taken to help rescue Lot. Abram, his 318 soldiers, and his friend Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Maybe they're men, we don't know for sure, it doesn't really say. They went after the enemy king. So Abram caught up with the enemy up north in the area that was called Dan in Moses's time. So they now travel north back through Canaan up to the head of the Jordan River. They catch up to the enemy king. During the night, he strategically separates his army and he attacks the enemy while they were caught off guard. Abram's army then chased them for miles until they were beaten. He recovers Lot, his family, and everything that was plundered in the area. So all of those spoils of war that the enemy king had picked up, now Abram has collected.
That's what people call
Say again?
it. What people call it, like they say we did.
Yes. Yep. So, verse 17 says that after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer, weird word, that's the enemy king, and the kings allied with him. Okay, so that means Abram's army here didn't beat just one king. He beat all of those kings that were allied with this one that had captured Lot and his family. The king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shava, which is the king's valley. So based on this, like I said, this isn't just one army that General Abram now has defeated. If you go back to the beginning of the chapter, how many kings had banded together to go after these rebel kings? It was it 4 to beat 5 or 5 to beat 4? But anyway, it's a bunch, okay? So it appears that General Abram is pretty good at strategy. And he goes and defeats these enemy kings. Now, the place where the king of Sodom met them was a common meeting place. Okay, it was kind of like it was an area between the kingdoms, kind of like neutral ground. Okay, so that's why they called this the Valley of the Kings, because the kings would come down there to negotiate with each other. They would make different kinds of agreements, or they would meet there to make truce. Okay, if that's after a time of fighting. So they would make business there. They would also make war there. This is a very common place and a common event for them to do. Then we get to verse 18. And I had to pause and actually put the scripture in here because this is the guy that Pastor Jesse has been mentioning now for several chapters in Hebrews. And we're going to hear it again in the next several weeks. As Jesse is going through Hebrews, he continues mentioning this guy, Melchizedek. Okay, so verse 18, it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of the God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So these are all the spoils of war now that Abram has picked up after beating these kings. Gold, silver, jewels, slaves. Okay. Abram takes a tenth of everything and gives it to Melchizedek. It's a tithe. Actually, in some translations, it'll say gave him a tithe of everything. So that was a tenth. That's the first time that we see in scripture this idea of giving a tenth of your possessions to God. Okay, that was a tithe.
Is that the, it makes me remember like Cain and Abel, because a tenth is, that's like your best.
Yeah.
It's not just any part of it.
Right,
It's
first
the
fruits.
First fruits, okay.
First and best. Okay, so there is a ton of stuff in here to talk about. And so next week, I'm actually going to break from the children's Bible stories, and we're going to be focusing on Melchizedek from back here in Genesis, so that will give you some context with what Jesse is preaching about in Hebrews. Okay, because the writer of Hebrews keeps on referring to Melchizedek, but if we really don't know who Melchizedek is, we're having to do a lot of catch up with what he's saying. Now, the first thing that I'm going to tell you is that Melchizedek is a priest, obviously, that we see here, but he's also a king. He's a priest and king. And where is he from? What's it say? Salem. Okay. And Salem is the old name for a town that we're very familiar with in the area, Jerusalem. Jerusalem.
You know, this is kind of related to why the king was taken away from King Saul.
Yes. Yeah, we're not going to go into that when we talk about Melchizedek, though. I wasn't going to talk about him at all, but Pastor Jesse yesterday said you might want to do that. So that's next week.
Get the inside scoop.
Yeah, that's next week. So he wanted me to kind of give y'all the meat of it, so that when you're out there at church, you can explain it to other people when they want to know more about Melchizedek. You'll be armed to be able to tell them more about him. So a lot of stuff here. We're going to spend all next week just on Melchizedek. All right. So verses 21 through 24, the king of Sodom then thanks Abram, but he demands for his people to be returned to him. And he offers Abram the spoil of wars. Well, wait a minute. First of all, this offer happens after Abram just gave a tenth of everything to Melchizedek. So the king of Sodom is standing there and he's like, but that's my stuff. That's my people. What are you doing giving my stuff to him? So we've got a problem here because King Bera of Sodom, he has no right to ask for anything. This king of Sodom is a defeated king. He's already been beaten by Kedorlaomer or whatever his name is. And then Kedorlaomer was beaten by Abram. So if Sodom got beaten by a king that got beaten by Abram, what does that mean? Abram owns this king. Victor's rights. And yet this king is saying, you need to give me all my people, but I'm going to be nice to you and let you keep all the rest of the stuff. It doesn't make sense at all. And this king knows it, but it shows you how wicked he is. He plays by his own rules, not the rules of society. He's a beaten king saying, you need to give me my stuff back. Throwing a little tantrum. Yeah, absolutely. So Abram, then he just says, fine, I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal. So basically, the king has demanded everything, and Abram says, I wasn't going to keep it anyway. I don't want any of your stuff. Why? It's evil. It is evil because it's kind of like blood money, ill-gotten gains. You know, you don't want that stuff. So there's really a couple of things here. First of all, we need to understand that Abram is a man that's growing in his faith. And he is starting to get a good understanding now that everything that he has, every blessing that he's gotten along the way, has come because of God.
Dude, he's got evidence.
He's got evidence. He's got nothing that he got on his own. Everything he tried to get on his own gets messed up. So now he's starting to understand, I have a lot. And the reason I have a lot is because God gave it to me, not because of anything that I did. So now here's all this stuff, this extra stuff that he's now gotten. And he's like, I don't deserve any of this, because it was God that gave me the victory over all of these other kings and their armies. So Abram has sworn to God that he will take nothing from Sodom, because he doesn't want the king of Sodom, or anyone else for that matter, to take credit for Abram's success. Because who did Abram's success come from? God.
Well, he probably didn't want to insult God either.
And he didn't want to insult God either. And you're going to hear more about that next week when we talk about Melchizedek.
You know, I can't see the king of Sodom had that much to offer anyway.
So he was beaten king, but who had all the stuff? Abram. And so it doesn't make sense. It's totally upside down.
And I have a question about the saddle strap, the
Sandal straps. They're so common, they have no worth. So even the cheapest thing that I may have from the spoils of war, I don't even want that. You can have it all.
But isn't it mentioned in several other parts of the Bible that they use their sandal or whatever and threw it down and it meant something?
It was a challenge to war if you threw your sandal down in front of somebody.
Oh, okay.
I still remember George Bush when they threw sandals at him.
Yeah.
And he said, I can see into your soul. So you shoot.
It was like, miss me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the second thing is that he doesn't want to be associated in any way or sense with the wicked culture of Sodom or their king. And he's making it very clear here that everything that he has was given to him by God. So basically he's saying, here, take it all. It's all good. I gave the part to Melchizedek, almost let the cat out of the bag. to Melchizedek, you could just have the rest. I don't want it. Okay, so next week we're going to be talking about specifically the high priest and king Melchizedek. Okay, Jimbo, I may have to bend your ear a little bit this week because I know that you actually are a little more versed in Melchizedek than I am. So I'll be doing my homework, preparing for y'all. So any more questions about General Abram this week? How many of y'all knew that he was a general of the armies?
I actually did.
Strange to hear you refer to him as General.
General Abram. Yeah, that's something that we usually don't hear about.
Well, it has to be those guys were leaders. You're like George Washington.
Yeah, yeah, but grassroots type of leader. Absolutely.
You know, you can go back and you can look at if you watch the series The Vikings.
Oh, yeah, I
You know,
love it.
like King Harold and all the rest of those guys, when they call them kings, they just look like everybody else.
Yeah, and that's what these are, just little tribal leaders that are trying to gather more power, more people, more land. That's exactly what's going on. Okay, cool. Any other questions, comments? Anybody? All right, cool. Finished almost on time today.
Question, what's the thought for little kids?
I don't know,
Is
actually.
that part of the, like,
Have a
celebration
big
for
mess of
the
enchiladas or something?
I haven't heard of that, so I don't know. Do not know.
For the first time the other day, I was listening to a preacher and he mentioned the whole water canopy over the earth. That's the first time I heard it other than in here.
Cool.
I was like, I knew
Yeah,
that
I know
already.
about that. All right, y'all have a great day.
Are you all playing?